Creative individuals are often considered odd, writes Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in his book Creativity, or even arrogant, selfish, and ruthless. It is important to keep in mind that these are not traits of creative people, but traits that the rest of us attribute to them on the basis of our perceptions. In fact, creative people are neither single-minded, specialized, or selfish. Indeed, they seem to be the opposite. They love to make connections with adjacent areas of knowledge. Today we're going to take a look at some creative people in history. This is part 3 of the series on creativity. We're going to look at what they have in common, and it's less than you think. The reason I want to do that is to point out to you that you don't have to have a particular set of traits, a particular upbringing, or anything else to be a creative person. Really, it comes down to, as we said last week, when we closed episode 37, part 2 of this series, it's practice. Practice doing the work of creativity. But first, let's talk low and slow. It's how I cook my ribs, and that's how Kettle and Fire cooks their bone broth. Get it simmering low and slow for 10 plus hours with organic vegetables and herbs. Deliver delicious broths and soups to you, full of collagen, nice chunk of protein per serving. You can drink it just like tea. It'll help you recover from your workouts faster. It'll help with your intermittent fasting. And a lot of their stuff is keto friendly. I know a lot of you are doing a keto or modified keto diet. It'll be good for either, whether you're doing the high fat, low protein, very low carb, that is the prescription, or the high fat, high protein modification that a lot of people do. You can get 10% off your order by visiting kettleandfire.com using code BetterHumanhood at checkout. It's kettleandfire.com. Use code BetterHumanhood at checkout for 10% off your order. And now, let's do the show.
Welcome to Better Humanhood, where we build a better world by building better people. We have to live on the planet, and we have to live with other people. We have conversations about making that a wonderful proposition.
I hope that you are having a wonderful day, wonderful moment, a wonderful life. Welcome back to Better Humanhood. This show goes on because you rate, review, and share with your friends and family. So please, if something here attracts you, moves you, give it a share. Whether you post it on Facebook for everybody, or whether you just send it to one friend who you think needs to hear it, I appreciate you. Now back to part 3 of our 4-part series on creativity. There are a few examples of creative people who came up multiple times in my reading for this series, and then I'm going to toss a more contemporary example into the mix. I wanted to see what these folks have in common, and as I said in the introduction, it seems that the answer is very little. On the one hand, that means there's not much of a pattern for you to follow, although there are some things you can do. We talked about practice, we talked about doing the work, and we will get more prescriptive in the final part of this series next week. On the other hand, it means that if you're not blessed with whatever gifts some of these folks were blessed with, it doesn't mean that you can't be a great innovator. You can be a great creator without any innate talent. In fact, as we will discuss next week, doing the work is really the best way to ensure a creative life. Creative persons differ from one another in a variety of ways, Csikszentmihalyi writes, but in one respect, they are unanimous. They all love what they do. You won't find a lot of creative people doing creative work who don't love what they do. A lot of people get into their creative work, if it's their vocation, as an avocation. It starts as a hobby. They find they're really good at it and they really enjoy it. And so they make it their job and they're really, really good at it. It's a pretty important thing, right? Our old friend Elkhonon Goldberg, who we quoted extensively in part 1 here, and he came back up last week in part 2. He agrees. Even in the same field, top innovators have very different creative styles, lifespans, and lifestyles. It is clear that there are multiple paths to creative greatness. Csikszentmihalyi notes that there are 3 types of people who might be considered creative. First type is those who are interesting and who may express unusual thoughts, but who make no major contribution. Second type is a person who's insightful, who sees the world in novel ways. The third is someone who makes a profound public creative achievement. The first type of person is probably your favorite backyard barbecue guest, or the person you hope is at the bar because the last time you had a crazy conversation, but in all likelihood, nobody's going to have ever really heard of them. Second group, people who see the world in novel ways. That makes me think about comics. The third group, people who make profound public creative achievements, makes me think of people like Einstein and Da Vinci. Csikszentmihalyi and his team of researchers interviewed more than 100 people across a bunch of different fields, and they identified 10 dimensions of highly creative people. 1, creative individuals have a great deal of physical energy, but they are often quiet and at rest. 2, creative individuals tend to be smart but naive, so they've got intelligence. Sometimes the common sense might not be there. 3, creative individuals have a combination of playfulness and discipline, of responsibility and irresponsibility. 4, creative individuals alternate between imagination and fantasy at one end and a rooted sense of reality at the other. 5, creative people seem to harbor opposite tendencies on the continuum between extraversion and introversion. And if you read Susan Cain's book, Quiet, you'll understand this a little better. Introverts tend to pull energy from being alone, while extroverts tend to pull energy from being around others. But to do your best work, you really need to be alone, even if you are with others a lot, even if you get your energy from others. And even if you do your best work alone, you need others around you to share with. 6, creative individuals are also remarkably humble and proud at the same time. Seems to be a lot of dichotomies here, right? 7, creative individuals often escape gender role stereotypes. Csikszentmihalyi's words, not mine. 8, creative people must be both traditional/conservative and rebellious. We'll talk about that a little more. To be creative, you really need to understand the rules before you can break them. 9, creative people are passionate about their work, but they're objective about it too. They can take a step back, see what's good, see what's bad. And finally, the openness and sensitivity of creative individuals often exposes them to suffering and pain, yet it allows them a great deal of enjoyment. Nancy Andreessen also suggests a possible link between creativity and mental illness. John Nash, who you'll recognize from the film A Beautiful Mind, was schizophrenic. Van Gogh and Martin Luther were depressive with bouts of mania, and lots of creative people commit suicide. Obviously, though, that one's not prescriptive the way Csikszentmihalyi's list is. It's just a thought. We can't really instill mental illness in someone to make them more creative, if you see what I'm saying. So let's take a look at some creatives across fields and across time. I'm just going to pull together some commonly available biographical information, see if we can find some commonalities here, particularly ones that we can emulate. For the sake of comparison, we're going to pick a pair of people in several fields and then a few more outliers and see if anything stands out as something you can learn. It seems like the running theme here is people figured out what they like to do at a young age. Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, lived fewer than 36 years. His dad was a composer and teacher, and the younger Mozart was sitting at his elder sister's sides watching her learn instrument by the time he was 3. In his less than 36 years on the planet, he composed more than 600 works. He married in his 20s, had 6 children, 4 of whom died in childbirth, became a Freemason when he was 28, and died of an illness, we don't know what, in his mid-30s. Despite his short life, he was considered a master composer, created hundreds upon hundreds of works, and was famous both during his life and in the over 200 years since his death. Someone else in the same field, Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven and Mozart had a lot in common. Both came from Austria, both learned instruments at a very young age, both composed hundreds of pieces. But unlike Mozart, Beethoven had a tough life. He relied on patronage, giving private concerts for money. He was never famous in his life. He lived to 56, so quite a bit longer. He says he started quite a bit longer than Mozart. He says he started losing his hearing around the age of 28, after he fell during a fit of rage when he was struggling with his work. I don't know what writer's block looks like for you, but that seems extreme. Of course, he kept composing, and his most famous work, his Ninth Symphony, was composed in 1824. He couldn't hear the orchestra play it. He couldn't hear the applause after people heard it for the first time. He became way more famous after he died than he ever was while alive. Let's move on to math. Évariste Galois lived to 20 years old. He died after a duel. He solved a 350-year-old mathematical riddle. He united group theory and field theory, and he didn't even get into the school he wanted. He picked up a complicated math textbook at the age of 14, read it like a novel, got his teenage butt to work, and then shut his mouth off. And then didn't shoot his gun off the way he should have. There's that conservative but rebellious we talked about. Carl Friedrich Gauss, on the other hand, also an important figure in math, lived to 77 years old. At the age of 19, very young, but almost the end of Galois' life. So think about that. He became the first to exemplify a regular 17-sided figure. He was so proud of the accomplishment that he wanted one on his tombstone. The guy who made the stone said no, it would just look like a circle. Only thing he had in common with Galois, he started working in math in his teens, and he kept at it. That's all. Now, inventors. Nikola Tesla lived well into his 80s. He claimed to work on the order of 20 hours per day, every day. He ate dinner at the same time in the same place virtually every day after he came to the U.S. His college, the university he went to, wrote letters to his father saying that Tesla would probably die young from being overworked. In his life, he registered over 300 patents, invented alternating current, demonstrated remote control, explained how wireless communication might work, helped capture power from Niagara Falls, denigrated women, and adored the work of Mark Twain. He walked between 8 and 10 miles a day for exercise, showed barely any weight change for about 40 years of his adult life. He had an eidetic memory, what some people would call photographic, which is technically inaccurate. And for sure, if he were alive today, he'd be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Thomas Edison was born a couple of decades before Tesla, and Tesla admired him greatly, but only worked for him for a short time. Like Tesla, Edison registered hundreds of patents and lived into his 80s. He's most famous for the light bulb and the phonograph and his perseverance. He's credited with saying that he never failed. He merely found 10,000 ways not to construct a filament. Edison only went to school for a few years. He was mostly taught by his mother. He married twice and had 6 children, so he had a very different life from Tesla, other than the fact that they both lived into their 80s and filed hundreds of patents. Now let's look at a couple of Singular geniuses. Albert Einstein was so famous during and after his life that his name literally is used to signify genius both seriously and sarcastically. He was a thinker. In addition to having come up with generalized relativity, he put together a group of friends who read everything from philosophy to science to math for discussion. He famously had correspondence on race with the singer Paul Robeson, and while he suggested the U.S. do research into atomic weapons to counter the work being done in Germany ahead of World War II, he also decried the use of such weapons. He worked for a time as a clerk at the Patent Office. He married twice, had 3 children, one out of wedlock with his first wife, who either was put up for adoption or died of scarlet fever. That would be the child, not the wife. Einstein lived into his 70s. Leonardo da Vinci might be one of the last people to be truly ahead of his time. Remember, he was born in the mid-14th century. He conceived of things like helicopters and calculators and solar panels, at least in principle, and designed centuries before those things were possible. His Vitruvian Man illustrated the golden ratio, which is related to the Fibonacci sequence and aligns with both the Vedic and the Kabbalic symbols as well. His Mona Lisa might be the most famous painting ever. His Last Supper is the most reproduced religious artwork in history, and a Salvator Mundi credited to him, though it may not be his, set records for price received at auction. That, by the way, was somewhere around $450 million. No one knows exactly where that painting is. They think it might be on a yacht. Da Vinci never married. He was born out of wedlock in 15th century Italy, and he lived into his mid-60s. I wanted to add one person to this, just to really throw a wrench into the famous people, trope I've got going on here. Philip Petit is the only person living on this list. He's 70 years old now, and by his count, he's been arrested over 500 times in various countries. He's most famous for his 1974 tightrope walk between the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, which was outlined in the films The Walk and Men on Wire. That obviously took months of planning. He didn't get clearance for it. He was arrested immediately after coming off the wire. Same thing happened with his walk between the towers of Notre Dame and on the Sydney Harbor Bridge. In his book, Creativity, The Perfect Crime, Petit says he gets it in his head to do something, and he does whatever it takes to get it done. In addition to being a tightrope walker, he's an expert juggler, fencer, rock climber, equestrian rider, carpenter, and bullfighter. It's a wide range, huh? He's married with 1 child. So, Petit, Einstein, Mozart, Edison, married with kids. You can be creative and famous for being creative or innovative. It's all in doing the work. What do all these people have in common then? They had various lifespans, started in their field at different times. Some were specialists, others generalists, some married, some not. Some were involved in political controversies. Some were disabled in their field during their lives. Some didn't even make it into college. Some were reckless in their lives, others very conservative. But they all worked hard. They all worked consistently, and that's the key. Next week, the final part of this series, we will look at prescriptions for bringing more creativity into your life. In the meantime, be who you are. Be who you will to be. We will see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Get show notes and more at betterhumanhood.com. Leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And have yourself a wonderful day.